now move on to the special session. First, research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, ISA, co-leader of the expert group on climate and SDG synergy, Mr. Luis Gomez Echeverry, Emeritus, will deliver a keynote speech via video. Following the video, research leader, Integrated Sustainability Center, IGES, Eric Zassman, will give a complimentary presentation.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank IGS and the team for the invitation to present our results of our work on synergies on climate and development. This is work that has been carried out over the last year and a half with a large group of experts, including a very good team from IGES, Professor Takeuchi, who and his team who have been instrumental in helping us to make this report not only valid and full of evidence, but also much more comprehensive and timely. So we thank you very much. We have been carrying this work since last year. Last year we prepared an overall report presenting evidence on why synergies between climate and development are important. This year we have focused on 4 thematic areas, knowledge and data, and I will say why that is so important, on frameworks for and tools and models for synergistic action, on new financial system for synergistic action, and cities as platform for synergistic action. And on the basis of those 4 reports, we wrote the synthesis report, and the results that I'm presenting here is a summary, highlights. In the interest of time, of course, I will only focus on some of the most important ones. Over and over again, our reports, our evidence, global reports that are being issued by the UN, by the UNFCCC, by many international institutions, are talking about the importance of acting on climate and development in synergy. They need to be approached together, and the reasons are many. Halfway through the deadline to 2030, what we find is that the SDGs are very much far behind. And it's the same thing with the Paris Agreement. We are not getting very close to achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement of the 1.5 degree, and we need to correct that. We believe that synergies and acting synergistically between climate and development is one way to address these weaknesses. But just very quickly, as a background, what do we mean by synergies? Synergies occur when multiple actions combine to produce results that are greater than the individual contributions. And here we're talking about when we approach climate and development together rather than separately, we achieve a greater action. And the trade-offs is when we implement either these synergistic policies or any policies, there might be trade-offs, and these trade-offs might have negative effects on parts of the population, and we need to address those, we need to assess them, we need to identify them, and then we need to mitigate or even to try to avoid them. So why do we need synergy? 80% of the SDGs and targets are linked to climate. 2030 is a major launch pad for a meaningful and sustained transformative action for the future up to 2050. Synergistic action has to be right at the center of what we have to do and as part of this transformation. Only 23 of the 173 nationally determined contributions explicitly refer to SDGs. So if synergies between climate and development are so important, why is it that only a few of these important national reports only address this? How climate change will affect the achievement of nearly 60% of the SDG targets. That's also why we need synergies. Here we're talking about effects on those related to education, to health, to inequality, to innovation, resource production and consumption. And all of these are poorly understood. And we need to create much more persuasive and data to show that this cannot continue. And the synergistic approach also entails increasing cooperation and collaboration, and this is the positive part, is having communities working together, policymakers working together, private sector and public sector working together. Without this collaboration, we will not achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. It's that simple. In our report, we also present the high costs of working in silos. And here we're talking about millions and millions of jobs which are put at risk. We also are presenting data on the millions of people that are at risks of hunger because of effects of climate change on the agriculture. And most importantly also is by acting in silos, we are foregoing a lot of the positive impacts that we could have in terms of lowering the costs of acting on climate and also on SDGs. In terms of the payoff, we also have a lot of evidence in our report. Of course, here I'm talking about the highlights, but I strongly recommend looking at some of the data and the evidence that we present. But by acting in synergy, we're reducing the financial gaps. We are achieving the targets faster. We are ensuring the just transition. And here in our report, and here I highlight some of the major figures which are in the report. I understand that the slides will be made available. So this is all available for you to take a deeper look at all of this. So again, if synergies between climate and development are so effective, why is it that they are not being uptaken? Many barriers, and we present those in our report. Here I will highlight three, which I think are the most important. The first one is fragmentation across governance, fragmentations across financing, the financial flows that come from international organizations at the local level from ministries are all going different directions rather than in an integrated manner. And fragmentations across knowledge. Knowledge and data is extremely dispersed, and we need to do something about addressing this fragmentation, and I talk about that in a few minutes. So we need to, how do we address that? We need to strengthen the institutional coordination. We need to overcome incoherence in implementation. We need to navigate the policy constraints by identifying shared ideas, visions, to get people and communities and sectors working together. And then we need to provide the frameworks and the tools and other resources that can facilitate to identify synergistic action. The second one is finance. And this is a major one that there's a lot of discussion for the past year and a half, and there are a lot of many suggestions for addressing this in the Summit for the Future, because what we have is an international financial architecture which was created, established many decades ago after World War II, and what we have today is a financial architecture that is not fit for purpose. There are a lot of actions that are being taken to address this, but in the meantime, we have a financial architecture with a lot of failures to invest in the amounts needed, both in climate change and the SDGs, failure to invest in the sectors most in need, which are climate resilient infrastructure, climate resilient food system, health, I mentioned before, gender, indigenous groups, failure to invest in the areas most in need, primarily adaptation, which is having very few resources in comparison to to mitigation and failure to invest in geographies that are most vulnerable. And the next barrier is I already mentioned that dispersed knowledge and data. And the problem with that is if we don't have the proper knowledge and data, we're not enhancing our understanding of the economic need to pursue synergies. We are not accurately reflecting the physical climate and transition risks. We're not facilitating the mechanisms for co-financing between public and private sector, and we are not elucidating concepts and reports consistencies of those green taxonomies, which are so important. So we need to address the knowledge and data so that we can take a look at these important aspects that we need to address. So what are the enablers? We are saying that the major enablers, localizing and tailoring solutions to local priorities and contexts. We do not need top-down approaches that don't address the local nuances. Cities are good areas to identify the local priorities. We're saying that demand-side solutions are extremely important, but if we don't have, but they need to be done at the local level. And the next one that I wanted to flag is that this is to show who is suffering the most from the inconsistencies of climate and development. If you look at the map on the left-hand side, the most impacts of climate change on agriculture, on the poorest areas of the world. On the right-hand side, who is suffering the most. And here we're talking about, again, the poorest areas, and these are who is suffering the most in terms of the climate change. The report also gives a number of very good suggestions and recommendations. Here I will only flag a couple of them. Policy coordination. We need to be inclusive so that we don't leave anyone behind. We need to build institutional capacity. We talked about finance. This is one of the major priorities. We need to build resilience and drive change. We're also suggesting that for the next assessment report of the IPCC, that we need to have a special report that looks at the synergies between climate and development. And with this, I finish. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to provide some major highlights of this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to say a few quick words about IJ's contribution to the work on synergies and why I think synergies can help catalyze or drive transformative change by tying this to a very personal example. So the very notion of synergies is grounded in the idea that capturing positive interactions between our responses to climate change and our efforts to achieve other development priorities can bring about big changes to the systems that we currently live in. So to be more concrete, it can translate responses to things that are often perceived as global, long-term, and uncertain. And it can translate those responses into something that can be local, near-term, and certain. And those local, near-term, certain benefits, I will argue, are the types of things that we can see drive big transformative changes to the way that we work, live, and the way that we interact with the environment. And so I want to give a very personal example of how I see synergies contributing to transformative changes. To do that, I'd like to turn to my hometown. So this is a small town in Massachusetts, about 70 kilometers away from Boston, Massachusetts, that was founded in 1669. And I spent much of my early childhood there. And when I look back in the history of Middleborough, Massachusetts, what I discovered is there's been significant transformative changes, which I would argue have a lot to do with a synergies argument, not necessarily focusing on climate change per se, but making links between big, broad issues like independence, freedom, and mobility, and then people's livelihoods. So let me show you a picture of Middleborough, so I said it was founded in 1669. Let me show you a picture approximately 250 years later of Middleborough. Sorry. So this is Middleborough, Massachusetts in the 1890s. And actually, if I go back in my childhood recollections, I can remember this type of street. Of course, it had already been paved and whatnot, and there were no more railroad tracks there. But in the course of about 20 to 30 years, Middleborough went from this to this. And part of the reason was for things related to the sort of industries, and some of the famous people in Middleborough became very interested in the automobile. And they latched onto the automobile as a way to not only promote their own freedom, but also to drive the economy. So for instance, in 1914, Middleborough set up one of the first manufacturers of fire engines. And some of those fire engines actually made it all the way to Tokyo, Japan. And as you can see from this image, this is what I would call transformative change. Just to go back again, this is Middleborough 20 years previous. This is Middleborough in 20, 30 years later. So when we talk about big transformative changes, it's about making those connections between sort of broad, abstract things that, like climate change, that still seem sort of out there, to our own sort of personal well-being. And I think this is an example of how we can see transformative change. You can also see this in this example right here. This is just looking at the different words in the main newspaper in Middleborough from the 1850s all the way out to the 1950s. And you can see right around this period that I showed you between those pictures, the number of references to horses, which was the primary means of transportation in the city, were eclipsed or carried over right around the same period. And so when we talk about synergies, I think it's really important to tie it back to our own personal experiences and use that as a way to leverage that concept to drive responses to climate change, biodiversity, and some of the major environmental threats we face today. Thank you very much.